I had been driving for what seemed like an eternity, around 2 hours, to reach the Marriott in Baltimore. Claire, my wife, was attending a conference there, and I wanted to surprise her with dinner. However, my primary reason for the visit was more urgent. Over the past 3 months, I had been plagued by suspicions that Claire might be seeing someone else. Whenever she returned from work trips, she came back later than anticipated. Tonight, I intended to confront these doubts head-on and resolve the growing unease. We've been married for 14 years with 2 wonderful kids, Sarah, 12, and Jake, 10, who were staying with my mom. Claire and I married right after high school, after dating for a few years. She had always been this vibrant, attractive woman, but recently, something had shifted. I tried not to seem paranoid or jealous, so I kept my concerns to myself. With the conference being so close, it was the perfect chance to drop in unannounced. At the hotel, I gave my suit bag to the front desk and introduced myself as Adam Taylor. I mentioned that Claire was in room 214 for the conference and that she had said I could get a key. Once the clerk confirmed my identity, I took the key and headed to the elevator, my nerves on edge. I was consumed with questions about how I would handle the situation if I found her with someone. When I reached the door, I used the key and entered quietly. Claire was at the desk, going through paperwork, and looked surprised to see me. I quickly explained that I had some free time and wanted to take her out for dinner. She seemed genuinely pleased and even suggested staying the night, giving me a big kiss. My plan to catch her in the act had backfired. Then, when I jokingly mentioned spending time together before dinner, she slyly suggested a quick intimate moment before her shower, promising more later. Relieved, I thought maybe I'd been overreacting. We shared a brief, passionate encounter, and then she went to shower. While waiting, I noticed her toiletry bag and decided to check for aspirin. Instead, I found a pack of 6 condoms. My heart sank. After Jake's birth, Claire had switched to birth control pills, and I had a vasectomy. The presence of condoms was a clear sign that Claire was cheating. Unsure of my next steps, I decided to use a safety pin to puncture the condoms. As Claire showered, I called my friend Rob, asking him to call me in an hour with an urgent issue so I could leave. When Claire came out, I struggled to conceal my feelings. Despite wanting to confront her, I kept calm. At dinner, I acted normally, but was internally distraught. Claire, unaware of my turmoil, ordered a small filet mignon and rose. I probed about her happiness with our marriage, and she assured me she was content, mentioning our nice home, great kids, and loving husband. Her reassurances felt hollow, knowing the truth. I downplayed my concerns, making a joke about pinching myself to believe I had her. Claire called me a silly goose, insisting I had nothing to worry about. Our dinners arrived, and we made small talk throughout the meal, but my mind was elsewhere. I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd found. Then, just as the plates were being cleared, my phone rang. It was Rob, right on schedule. I excused myself to the lobby to take the call, making sure to wait a few minutes before heading back to the table. When I returned, I told Claire that Rob had called to let me know about a burst pipe at the school and that I really needed to get back there as soon as possible. Claire's face fell, but I couldn't tell if she was genuinely disappointed or just annoyed that her evening had been cut short. Either way, it seemed like whether I stayed or left didn't matter much to her. She was going to face some consequences either way. As we headed back to the elevator, a man I didn't recognize stepped out and greeted Claire like an old friend. He introduced himself as Tom Bradley and mentioned that he'd stopped by her room earlier but no one had answered. He extended his hand to me and said, "Claire talks about you all the time." "I'm Tom." I forced a smile and shook his hand, though it was difficult to fake the pleasantries. As we rode up in the elevator, I couldn't help but feel the knot in my stomach tighten. This was the guy, wasn't it? This was the man she was cheating with. Once we were back in the room, I turned to Claire and told her flat out that I wanted her to quit her job. I couldn't stand the idea of her working with Tom anymore. We'd talked about it before, but I needed to make it clear that this was non-negotiable. She shot back that she wasn't quitting and that I needed to get over my paranoia about her and Tom. She made it sound like I was the one with the problem, not her. After a quick, icy kiss, I grabbed my bags and left the hotel, my mind reeling with anger and betrayal. The whole drive home, I couldn't shake the image of Tom stopping by Claire's room. By the time I reached the house, I was a wreck. I hated her for what she was doing, and I hated myself for not being able to do anything about it. Divorce was the only thing on my mind, but without solid proof, I felt defeated. My wife was cheating, and I knew it, but I was stuck, unable to take action. 2 days later, Claire came home from the conference, acting as if everything was perfectly normal. She was cheerful, almost annoyingly so, which only fueled my anger. I had to do something. While she was busy unpacking, I couldn't help myself. I checked her bag. Again, there it was, one last condom, still with the tiny hole I'd poked in it. How many had she gone through in just those few days? The thought made me sick. That Saturday, the company Claire worked for, Liberty Insurance, hosted a picnic for employees and their families. The kids were excited about the day, but I wasn't looking forward to it at all. I had a hunch that some of her colleagues knew about the affair, and I dreaded the thought of becoming the subject of office gossip or crude jokes. I was probably being paranoid, but with everything going on, I couldn't help it. CLA was in her element, laughing and chatting with her coworkers, including Tom. They weren't openly affectionate or anything, but there was a closeness between them that I couldn't ignore. It was like everyone else disappeared when they talked. I tried to keep a low profile, not wanting to draw any attention to myself. A woman I hadn't met before, Janet Bradley, introduced herself, saying she was Tom's wife. She was stunning, long auburn hair, big blue eyes, the kind of woman who could have stepped right out of a magazine. For a moment, I was genuinely confused. How could Tom cheat on someone like her? I'd always thought highly of CLA, loved her even, but Janet was something else entirely. We exchanged pleasantries, and after a bit of small talk, we agreed to find a quieter spot to chat. We ended up on some benches near the lake, far enough from the picnic area that we could talk without being overheard. Sitting there, I could tell that Janet had something serious on her mind. She hesitated, clearly struggling to bring up the subject. I decided to make it easier for her. I told her that I'd found out about the affair just that week. The relief on her face was immediate. She admitted that she'd known for about 2 months and had already decided to file for divorce. She'd even hired a private investigator to gather evidence. Janet explained that her lawyer had suggested asking Claire to testify or at least sign a notarized statement about the affair to strengthen her case. I asked her what kind of proof she had, and she mentioned photos and taped phone conversations, though no videos yet. She believed the evidence she had was more than enough to make a solid case. Then she asked if I'd be willing to use some of the same evidence in my own divorce proceedings. She also mentioned that she was planning to sue Liberty Insurance for negligence. Apparently, she had statements from other employees who knew about the affair and did nothing to stop it. Janet was determined to make Tom and CLA pay one way or another. She suggested we work together, sharing whatever evidence we had, and I agreed. It made sense to team up. Before we headed back to the picnic, Janet invited me over to her house the next day. Tom was going golfing in the morning, and she thought it would be a good time to go over everything she'd gathered. She lived at 26 Hemlock Avenue in Crestmont, just a short drive from where we were. We both laughed a little, knowing that meeting up wasn't exactly a date, but it felt like we were in this together now. When we got back to the picnic area, it seemed like no one had noticed we were gone. I felt better, like maybe there was a way out of this mess after all. The next morning, as expected, Claire told me she was heading out to do some shopping and would be gone for a few hours. As soon as she left, I dropped the kids off at my mom's place and drove over to Janet's. She greeted me at the door, looking as composed as ever, and led me into her den. The room was cozy, with a large leather couch and a computer monitor on the table in front of it, showing an empty motel room. Janet motioned for me to sit down and offered me something to drink. I opted for a Pepsi and then asked her what was going on. Janet explained that we were about to watch Tom play a round of golf live and in full color. She hinted that I might recognize the caddy he was with. When I asked how she'd set this up, she casually mentioned that it had cost her about $1,400, but she figured Tom would end up covering the bill one way or another. The session was supposed to last a couple of hours, so she encouraged me to get comfortable. She even had popcorn and nachos ready and promised to give me a DVD of the whole thing afterward. She admitted that while she didn't really want to see what was going to happen, she also didn't want to miss it. For the next 20 minutes or so, we made small talk. Janet shared more details about the affair, showing me photos, playing recordings, and laying out documents. The more she showed me, the more I realized just how deeply involved Claire and Tom were. It was heartbreaking, but at the same time, it was the proof I needed. Then, just as Janet had predicted, the monitor flickered to life. There they were, Tom and Claire, walking into the motel room together. They wasted no time undressing almost immediately, with no small talk or foreplay. The video was clear, though the sound was a bit garbled. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, my wife right there in front of me with another man. Watching Claire and Tom like that was one of the most uncomfortable experiences of my life. Janet, trying to lighten the mood, made a comment about how you don't often see a body like Claire's. I forced a smile, but honestly, I had no idea how to respond. It was surreal, and I didn't want to keep watching. After a few minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. I turned to Janet and told her that I didn't need to see the rest. I figured she wasn't too keen on continuing either. Janet sighed and agreed, admitting that watching it was pretty painful. We decided to stop the video, acknowledging that the lawyers had enough evidence now. I confessed to Janet that seeing my wife like that, especially with her sitting right next to me, was something I could barely stomach. The whole thing just felt wrong. Janet nodded, understanding completely, and suggested that we do something else. I was relieved when she mentioned showing me her koi ponds in the backyard. That sounded much more appealing than watching another minute of the video. Her eyes lit up when I showed interest in her hobby, and she seemed genuinely excited to share it with me. As we walked out to the backyard, I couldn't help but think how much better this afternoon was turning out for me than it was for Claire. The koi ponds were incredible. Janet had 3 of them, and each one was more impressive than the last. She explained the pumping and filtration systems, and I found myself fascinated, especially with my background in plumbing. I offered to help her out any time she needed it, just out of a desire to learn more about the koi ponds. Spending time with Janet was a bonus, but there was nothing romantic about it, at least not yet. We spent a few hours out there, the time flying by as we talked about everything but our cheating spouses. It was a welcome distraction. When we finally headed back inside, the motel room monitor was empty, signaling that Tom and Claire had left. It was time for me to go home. Janet walked me to the door and promised to call when Tom had his next golf game, suggesting that I bring Sarah and Jake over to see the koi ponds. It was a nice thought, something positive to look forward to in the midst of all this chaos. On the drive home, I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, anger, and a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, I could get through this. The next few weeks were tough. Every time Claire took a shower, I found myself checking her bag, and every time there was a new supply of condoms. I couldn't understand when she was finding the time to use them all, it was like she had some secret life I knew nothing about. I kept that safety pin on my keychain, ready to poke holes whenever I found another stash. Meanwhile, on the days when Tom had his golf games, I'd take the kids over to Janet's. They loved visiting the koi lady, as they called her. They'd draw pictures of the fish and proudly show them to Claire when we got home, but she never made the connection that Janet was Tom's wife. It was almost laughable how oblivious she was. Claire seemed relieved that I was able to keep the kids busy while she was otherwise engaged, as she put it. I tried talking to Claire a couple more times about quitting her job and ending things with Tom, but each time I got the same cold rejection. The second time was particularly harsh, with her making digs about my masculinity and insinuating that I was the problem. It stung, but it also made it easier for me to justify everything I was doing. I started finding excuses to avoid being intimate with her, and the less we were together, the more distant we became. I felt then, one night, Claire dropped a bombshell. She told me she'd been feeling really stressed out lately and thought it would be a good idea to take some time off work to visit her sister Nancy for a few days, maybe even a week. She said I'd been working so hard with all the overtime and late nights, and she thought it would be a chance for me to relax a little too. She made it sound like she was doing me a favor by taking this trip. I barely slept that night, my mind racing with everything I needed to do. Finally, the moment had come, and I had to act. The next day, after Claire left for her rest and recuperation trip, I started making my preparations. I had to explain the situation to my parents, admitting that I'd failed as a husband. They were incredibly supportive, offering to help in any way they could. The kids were thrilled to stay with their grandparents, and my dad's truck would be handy for moving Claire's stuff out of the house. On Thursday morning, I drove the 3 hours to the first clinic where I suspected Claire would go. When I got there, I hit a dead end that left me with one last option, the Family Planning Center. I walked in, trying to look as confident as possible, and told the receptionist that I was Adam Taylor and my wife Claire had sent me to sign some consent forms. I played dumb, acting like I wasn't sure what the exact form was called, but I mentioned that it was something about understanding the procedure and agreeing not to pursue any legal action. The receptionist nodded, checked her computer, and confirmed Claire's identity. She said Claire's sister had already signed for her, but my signature would be better. She handed me the file, and I quickly signed the form right beneath Nancy's signature. The procedure was scheduled for Friday morning at 11 a.m., with instructions to arrive an hour early. I asked if there were any remaining payments due, but the receptionist assured me that Claire had already paid the full $800 in cash. I thanked the receptionist and left the clinic, feeling both relieved and anxious. I had everything in place. The reception I got when I arrived at Nancy and Brad's place was predictably awkward. Claire seemed genuinely surprised to see me, asking what I was doing there. I told her that my parents had offered to keep the kids for a few days, so I'd taken some sick leave and decided to visit them. I mentioned that I needed to unwind a bit, just like she did. The room fell silent, and I could practically see the wheels turning in their heads. I'd put them on the spot, and now they had to figure out how to deal with it. Nancy gave Brad a nod, and he disappeared into the kitchen with her. Claire tried to keep the conversation light, but I could tell she was on edge. When Brad came back, he suggested that we take his buddy Jack's boat out on the lake the next day just to get away from everything. I agreed, saying that a day on the lake sounded perfect, even though I had no intention of going. The next morning, Jack was already waiting with the boat. When I made it clear to Brad that I wasn't going anywhere while he packed up lunch and stocked the cooler with beer, I just stood by the passenger door of his truck. When Brad asked if I was getting in, I told him flat out that I'd changed my mind. I wasn't going to waste the day on a boat with him and Jack. Instead, I told him to make the most of it because he'd have to deal with Nancy when he got back, and I doubted she'd be in a good mood. Brad tried to convince me to come along, even resorting to some light swearing and a few half-hearted threats, but after 5 minutes of back and forth, he realized I wasn't budging. Finally, he gave up, and he and Jack took off without me. Once they were out of sight, I headed back into the house, poured myself a cup of coffee, and turned off Claire's cell phone. I called my dad, who's always up early, and we chatted for about 2 hours while I ignored the constant call-waiting tones. I figured Brad must have been trying to reach Nancy to warn her, but I wasn't about to let that happen. Eventually, Claire and Nancy got up, and I said goodbye to my dad, preparing myself for the confrontation that was sure to follow. When Nancy's cell phone finally buzzed back to life, she and Claire had just about 5 minutes before they were supposed to be at the family planning center. I finished off the pot of coffee and brewed a fresh one for the two of them, knowing I was about to face some serious backlash. Claire looked at me, clearly annoyed, and asked what I was still doing there. I told her I wasn't in the mood for fishing and thought I'd stick around with them for the day. I suggested we find a nice place for lunch together since I had to leave that night anyway. Claire immediately shot down the idea, saying that she and Nancy had plans and didn't want me tagging along. She emphasized that they only saw each other a couple of times a year and that I had the whole week to spend with her. I wasn't having it. I pushed back, saying that since I'd driven all this way, the least she could do was spare me half a day. Nancy, clearly frustrated, left the room to make a phone call. Claire sat there, looking like she'd been hit by a truck, defeated. We could hear Nancy yelling at Brad on the phone as if he'd committed some unforgivable sin by leaving me behind. Claire tried one last time to convince me not to come, saying their plans didn't involve me and that I'd just be in the way. I calmly insisted that I'd like to know what their plans were so I could decide whether I wanted to join them or do something else. I even joked, asking if they were meeting up with some guys, which she quickly denied. Claire explained that they were planning to shop for personal items like bras, underwear, and nightgowns, things they didn't want a guy hanging around for. I shrugged and said most of those stores were in the mall, so I could easily find something else to do while they tried things on. I even offered to take them to a nice restaurant for lunch to make up for any inconvenience. Nancy reappeared in the doorway, glaring at me without saying a word. Claire could see that she wasn't going to win this argument, so she finally gave in, saying she needed to get dressed. About 20 minutes later, they both came downstairs, clearly irritated but resigned to the fact that I would be joining them. I was coming with them. I suspected that the phone call Nancy had made was likely to the family planning center, possibly to reschedule the appointment. Since I'd said I was leaving that night, they probably figured they could wait me out and go after I left. I insisted on driving my car, making it clear that I wasn't about to let them ditch me somewhere. We stopped at a service station, and I took my sweet time filling up the tank, checking the oil and water, and cleaning the windshield. It was probably the longest I'd ever spent on routine car maintenance, and they just sat there fuming. When we finally got to the mall, I parked far away so we'd have a long walk to the entrance. Once inside, I let them do their thing, keeping my distance but making sure they knew I was there. They didn't seem to be enjoying themselves at all. Most of their time was spent whispering to each other and exchanging irritated looks. They bought a few things, but it was clear they were just going through the motions to make it seem like they were shopping. I kept an eye on them, but I wasn't really interested in what they were buying. The important thing was that I'd managed to delay the inevitable. The time for the appointment had passed, and I knew Claire would have to reschedule. I had no intention of stopping her from going through with it, but making it harder for her was my way of getting some small measure of control back. Around noon, we met up in the center court of the mall, just as we'd planned. We went to the Olive Garden for lunch, and afterward, we headed back to the house around 2 p.m. The car ride was filled with tension, but there wasn't much conversation. I could tell they were both furious with me, but I didn't care. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had the upper hand. When we got back to the house, I grabbed a beer and settled on the couch, feeling pretty satisfied with myself. A couple of hours later, Brad returned only to face a verbal assault from Nancy. That lasted a good 30 minutes. After she was done, he slipped out and disappeared until supper time. Later that evening, after the dishes were done, I asked Claire if we could talk privately in the kitchen. Nancy shot me a sneer but didn't say anything, and the two of them went into the living room. Claire was still upset from the day's events, and I could tell she wasn't going to be easy to deal with, but I was ready. I got straight to the point, telling her again that I wanted her to quit her job and end things with Tom Bradley. She clenched her teeth so tightly I thought they might crack, and she looked like she was barely holding herself back from hitting me. She insisted that she didn't want to hear it anymore, that I needed to stop bringing it up. Claire was fed up with me asking and said I already knew the answer wasn't going to change. She gave me an ultimatum: either change the subject or leave. I stood firm. I took out a legal-size envelope from my manila folder, revealing divorce papers. I told Claire I'd asked her multiple times over the last 2 months to leave her job and end her relationship with Tom, but she refused every time. I suggested she sign and mail the papers using the pre-stamped envelope I included. I told her she could consult a lawyer if she wished, but I was finished waiting for her decision. Claire's face contorted in anger. She leaned in, hissing that I couldn't divorce her just because she wouldn't quit her job or end her friendship with Tom. She insisted there needed to be grounds for divorce and claimed I had none. She advised me to get my act together and reminded me she was my wife, unwilling to give up her home or family for my dissatisfaction. I paused, then retrieved a stack of photos from my envelope. I placed 6 on the table, each depicting Claire and Tom in compromising situations. I asked if that provided sufficient grounds for divorce. Claire went pale, looking as if she might faint, but instead of showing remorse, she began yelling at me, accusing me of spying and being a pervert. She berated me for not confronting her directly and claimed my actions were despicable. At that moment, my phone rang with my dad informing me he'd arrive in 10 minutes with Claire's belongings. I ended the call and told Claire, still fuming, that my dad was bringing her things. I explained I'd changed the locks and offered to retrieve anything she might have forgotten. I handed her the car title, signed over to her, and an envelope with half of our joint bank funds, $200. I outlined her visitation rights with the kids, weekly, with a possible overnight once a month if she made a notarized statement about the affair. I also mentioned I had a DVD of her and Tom's encounter at the Scandia Motel. I collected the photos, clarifying I didn't take them myself, I just couldn't tolerate being lied to. Lastly, I revealed the safety pin I'd used to puncture the condoms she'd been using, noting she'd gone through 48 in 2 weeks. Her face reddened as she absorbed this. She called me despicable, but I told her cheating was worse. I said goodbye, reminding her she hadn't apologized or shown remorse, and wished her well for her upcoming procedure on Monday. Only then did Claire start crying. Nancy hurried in to comfort her, while Brad joined me on the porch, questioning why I would end a 14-year marriage over what he called a misunderstanding. I asked him why Claire had visited him and Nancy if that were true. Brad, clearly conflicted, muttered an apology and offered to help unload the truck. We finished quickly while Claire continued crying inside. To me, it was too little, too late. The following week, Claire and Tom were dismissed from Liberty Insurance. Claire refused to sign Janet's lawyer's affidavit, but my lawyer assured me we had a strong case without it. Claire didn't contact me afterward, nor did she visit the kids, who bonded with Janet instead. Janet and I focused on our divorces and our kids, and eventually, we were planning our wedding by June. We moved past the trauma of our previous marriages and looked forward to a fresh start. Life settled into a peaceful routine. Claire's new partner didn't fare well. He was severely beaten in a mugging, losing several teeth and one of his testicles. Karma seemed to have caught up with him. Janet and I continued to grow closer and eventually moved into a beautiful 6-bedroom villa she'd bought. She had also kept my old Jaguar XK140 hidden away, and we planned to take it out for a celebratory drive. As for Claire, she was still living with Nancy, dealing with the fallout from Tom's betrayal. I had moved on, ready for a new chapter with Janet. Thank you for your support and tuning into my stories. Stay tuned for more. Warm regards.